Hey everyone, welcome to BL Story of Love. If you are here for the first time, do not forget to subscribe, leave a like and turn on notifications. Get comfortable, put on your headphones, take a sip of tea. Because today you will hear a story about how a cold alpha lawyer pulled an Omega out from under a prison sentence and, instead of a bill, handed him a marriage contract. The camera slowly sank into a gray autumn city, courtyards packed with cars, wet asphalt. Rare leaves stuck to the grates of the drains. Somewhere around the third floor, a dull light burned in the accounting department of a small family company. There, behind the glass, an Omega named Ed spent his days. He always arrived earlier than everyone else. The corridors smelled of cleaning liquid and old coffee from the vending machine. Ed took out the key, opened the door to accounting, turned on the lights, sat at his place, a neat desk by the wall, away from the window and from the director's office. His life had long ago turned into a chain of routine movements: turn on the computer, check mail, open spreadsheets, reconcile payments. The family firm belonged to his relatives on his father's side. From the outside, it looked like a noble gesture. We took him in so he does not have to run around strange offices. In reality, Ed was the perfect workhorse. An Omega who did not argue, did not stick out, did not ask extra questions. The family had long understood they could load any routine onto him, and they did it with enviable creativity. He was used to being called "our boy," and at the same time, no one ever asked how he was living. His mother said he was lucky. He had a steady salary and his own tasks. Uncles and aunts used him as a free filter. Ed, check if this looks okay. Ed, move these amounts. Ed, sign here. You are the one who understands this. The first strange things started long before the arrest. For several months in a row, they brought him payment orders marked "temporary transfer, technical operation, we will move it back later." The documents had all the right signatures from management, stamps, all the formal details. The only thing that bothered him was the amounts, too large for regular work, too often repeated. He tried carefully to ask why the accounts were being opened in his name. In response, he heard the same thing, with a slight offended tone. "It is only a formality. You are family. It is silly to refuse trust. We are not strangers to you." Inside, a restless feeling rose up, but he pushed it down. Family cannot hurt you. That is what he told himself every time he signed another paper. In autumn, the air in the office became heavier. Relatives were nervous. They closed doors for meetings more often. They invited some unknown people in strict suits. Ed heard snatches of phrases: inspection, audit, will we have time to move it? But he diligently shut his ears. This is not my level, his habit said. His job was numbers. The morning that broke everything started like any other. He came in early, took off his wet coat, made himself instant coffee, turned on the computer. The spreadsheet window flashed its familiar rows. He even managed to open the payment plan for the coming week. Then, he heard unusually heavy footsteps in the corridor. Not one person, a group. Hard, measured shoe steps, voices that did not bother to lower themselves. The knock on the accounting door did not sound like their own people. There was authority in that sound. Ed raised his head, and in the next second, 3 strangers entered the room at once. 2 men and a woman, gray suits, badges, folders. Behind them loomed the figure of his cousin, suddenly very polite, almost sugary. IDs flickered before his eyes like frames in a bad TV show. Investigative department. Financial crimes. A warrant to seize documents and equipment. The words merged into a dull hum. Only a few phrases broke through to his mind: fraud, money laundering, large-scale tax evasion. At first, Ed tried not to understand that they were speaking about him. It seemed like this was some mistake, something being sorted out upstairs in the director's office. But within a few minutes, they came up to him, asked him to stand up from the desk and show his documents. They peered into his passport, compared the data with some printout, and calmly informed him that he was listed in the case as the person on whom the key accounts were opened. Staff had already gathered along the corridor. Some peeked out from behind doors, some pretended to be busy. Their eyes slid over him the way people look at someone who has suddenly been found to have a contagious disease. Ed felt a wave of shame rising in his chest, a shame he had not earned. Trying to find support, he glanced at his cousin. The cousin only lowered his eyes, not a single word. not a single gesture towards him. Later, Ed would learn that on that very day, the family released a press statement calling him an independent accountant who abused the trust of his employers. They let him take his jacket and his phone, then, with one confident movement, took the phone away as well. On the stairs, the smell of bleach mixed with the cold morning air. Outside, a car was already waiting. They put him inside and the doors slammed with a heavy final sound. At the station, he was met by an investigator with tired eyes and the voice of a man who already knows how this will end. The questions were tough but formal. Did you sign? Did you know? Did you understand? Outside the windows, it slowly grew dark, and the only thought floating in his head was how fast those who promised to protect him had disappeared. By evening, they read out the list of charges. He could not even immediately connect some of the words to himself. One particular line cut the deepest. Committed as part of a group. The group had stayed outside. Inside sat only him. They took him to a detention center as a vulnerable Omega. On paper, it looked like care. In reality, it meant a solitary cell, a narrow mattress, a metal bed, walls saturated with other people's fear over many years. At night, when the footsteps in the corridor went quiet, he really was alone. No phone, no familiar hum of computers, no annoying uncle's voice demanding reports. Yesterday, only him and the hollow walls smelling of damp and disinfectant. In his head, the phrases that once seemed harmless kept spinning. Be grateful we took you in. Without us, you would be lost. We know what is best for you. Now, those same words sounded like cynical spells they had used for years to convince him not to ask questions. Every signed document burned an imaginary hole in his palm. He remembered every signature, every stamp, this is only a formality. He tried to imagine what his relatives were doing now. Did anyone see his empty desk? Was anyone trying to call him? The answers came one after another, cold and brutally honest. No, they were not. On the third day, they finally allowed him to see his assigned counsel. By then, he had already heard snatches of news from the guards. The family was giving comments about shock and betrayal. Their lawyer was telling the cameras they would fully cooperate with the investigation and hope the guilty party is punished. On the gray cover of his case file, in the corner, in small but clear print, a new name had appeared, lawyer Leon Warren, Alpha, known for serious, complex cases and for pulling people out of seemingly hopeless situations when no one believed in them anymore. Big companies hired him. Sometimes scandalous individuals with loud stories. Why a man of that level agreed to take on an Omega, already announced to be the perfect scapegoat, remained a mystery in this first chapter. The viewer only saw how the strict folder with his name landed on the investigator's desk with a heavy, dull thud. And how, for a second, a guard peeked into Ed's cell, threw in a short, "Your lawyer's here," and the door shut again, leaving him alone with a new kind of hope, as frightening as the trial ahead. Leon woke up before the alarm, as he almost always did. The gray pre-dawn light barely seeped through the thick blinds. The glass of the panoramic windows felt cold and distant. The apartment on the top floor of the tower looked as if no one lived there. Too tidy, too empty, no scattered things, no trace of someone else's presence, no smell of last night's dinner, only coffee, documents, and straight lines. The kitchen looked more like a bar in an expensive office, an automatic coffee machine, 2 identical water glasses, an empty counter. Leon silently turned on the machine, leaned his hands on the countertop, and for a few seconds let himself stare into nowhere, listening to how the heavy tiredness echoed inside. On the wall opposite hung his diplomas, university, graduate school, certificates for difficult categories of cases. Among them there was one that did not quite fit, a small plaque with a faded photo and a date, a token from an Omega rights organization for his work on a high-profile case. That time he had lost. The Omega he defended did not live to see the appeal. Leon rarely let his gaze linger on that plaque, but every morning, walking past, he registered it at the edge of his mind like an unhealed scar. That case had taught him the main thing. Court is not always where truth wins. But he had no intention of backing away just because the system was rotten. He drank his coffee standing by the tall window, looking at the city that was only starting to wake up. Glass facades of neighboring towers reflected each other, merging into an endless corridor. Down below, office signs were already lighting up. Down there, someone was signing yet another contract. Someone was bending under a big name. Someone was too scared to ask what exactly they were being made to sign. He himself had no pack, a few colleagues who respected him without trying to get closer, a couple of acquaintances he could discuss a hard case with, but not personal things. A few former lovers whose names had long blurred into one in the flow of similar nights that never led to anything. For an alpha, a strange, almost antisocial life. For Leon, the only way not to let his home turn into a continuation of the courtroom. His apartment really did look more like a neat partner's office. Open shelves with law codes and commentaries, a metal stand for perfectly pressed suits, a narrow bed without extra pillows. On the coffee table there were not magazines, but stacks of files he sometimes brought from the office when someone's deadlines burned, especially bright. By day, his world shrank to the glass tower across the way. The firm his family had founded occupied several floors, reception, meeting rooms, a secure block for the most sensitive cases. Leon was one of the key partners, but he still lacked one condition to get full voting rights in the board. The older generation's will, written with blunt cynicism, laid down a rule. Only those heirs who presented a socially stable image could take part in managing the family firm. In other words, an official partner and a credible prospect of offspring. In their circle, paper marriages with alphas and betas were considered an acceptable form of deal. He had been offered options many times. Partners' relatives, distant members of respected families, betas ready for a marriage in exchange for money and status. Every time he refused, not because he saw no benefit. The very idea of marriage as a buy-sell contract made him feel the same way as this new case, a dirty scheme dressed up as morality. He did not want to become the kind of person he regularly tore apart in court. By midday, his day was fully scheduled. 2 hearings, 1 hard meeting with a corporation's representatives, several calls with regional offices, between them, a small gray rectangle in his calendar. New criminal case, Omega. His assistant had marked the meeting like that without going into detail. The real acquaintance with the case began in the evening, when the office had almost emptied. In a meeting room with a panoramic view of the night city, under the soft light of built-in lamps, Leon laid the folders out before him. A thick volume of interrogation records, account statements, expert reports, official responses from tax authorities. On paper, everything looked almost perfect for the prosecution. Every transaction, every transfer, every extra movement of funds went through the same accounts. All bore the name Edward, the Omega accountant. Shell companies, dummy firms, empty offices, all listed in neat rows. Where there should have been signatures of executives, there was his clean cursive. The relatives' testimonies read like a well-rehearsed monologue. They entrusted him with managing the funds. They saw him as part of the family. He abused their trust. He hid his operations from them. The sentences were smooth, polished to each comma, not a single rogue detail, not a single slip in tone, a text written by a lawyer's hand, not by the hearts of people truly shocked by someone's betrayal. Leon slowly turned page after page. He noted how neatly the scheme had been built, how every trace of those who had given the orders had been washed out of the chain of payments, how carefully internal correspondence had been cleaned, how a convenient, quiet Omega became an ideal lightning rod. He was used to dealing with predators who did not hide behind masks. Corporations openly taking risks for profit. Alphas who openly admitted they had pressured witnesses because they could. That world had its own dirty but honest logic. What irritated him here was something else, the deliberate morality. Those lines about family values used to cover blatant betrayal. How easily they had agreed to sign a press release naming the Omega the main culprit, and how skillfully they played the role of deceived benefactors in front of the cameras. He stopped at the transcript of Ed's first interrogation. Questions, answers, the investigator's side notes. Between the lines, he felt the panic of a man who had tried till the last moment to believe there had been a mistake. Phrases like, "I thought it was temporary. They told me it was necessary," flashed by like scattered shards. Leon picked out several key points. When the Omega had started signing suspicious documents, the different explanations he had been given, the gradual growth of the sums, and the fact that not one of his relatives had taken on even a gram of responsibility, everything came down to one line. He alone, he himself, he abused their trust. Cowards, slipped through his mind quietly, almost without emotion. He leaned back in his chair, rubbed his temple, trying to take the edge off the growing tension. Inside, a familiar feeling rose, a mix of contempt and anger, not at the victim who had signed the papers, at those who had spent years building a cage around him out of the words, "Be grateful, and without us you are nobody," and then slammed the door the second they smelled an audit. He looked at the clock. It had long gone dark outside. The city glowed with ads and apartment windows where life probably felt normal to someone. His own paper life reflected in the glass. A man in a suit, alone in an empty meeting room, surrounded by documents that reduced someone else's fate to a few volumes. The topic he had been pushing away for a long time returned stubbornly. The board of directors, voting rights, legal control over a share in the firm he practically ran already, while on paper he was still just one among many. The wills condition, an officially registered union, hung over him like a dull verdict. Endless conversations with relatives and partners boiled down to one. Pick someone, any convenient marriage. The picture is all that matters. Leon always answered no, not because he did not understand the stakes. The idea of a marriage as a sham transaction made him feel the same disgust as this case. Another dirty scheme dressed as virtue. He refused to become like the people he dismantled in court day after day, but as he looked at the photos in Ed's file, shots of the office, copies of documents, news clippings with the relatives' faces, a different line began to take shape in his mind. An Omega sold off to save the business, facing real prison time for someone else's greed. An Omega who, judging by the file, had no one and nothing left except this case. An Alpha who needed a union, not for romance, but for a vote, who did not plan a family for love, but also did not want to buy a fake image. The thought was cynical, even by his standards. That did not make it less logical. If this Omega really had not initiated the scheme, if he had not knowingly taken part, if his family was so ready to destroy his life, maybe they had more in common than it seemed. Deep in the part of his mind where future legal strategies usually formed, the outline of a plan appeared. Not just to pull the client out from under the verdict, not just to prove to the court that this was not the mastermind, but the victim, but to offer him later a deal that would flip both their worlds. A marriage contract instead of a fee, a cold, legally tight agreement where two people burned by their own family's systems, pooled resources not for cute photos but for survival. He would get that one condition that opened the door to the board. The Omega would get protection, a roof over his head, and a chance to live outside of someone else's last name. Leon caught himself feeling something he had not felt in a long time. This case interested him not only as a professional challenge. He was genuinely curious about the person behind that name on the page, how his voice sounded when he spoke not to an investigator, but just spoke, how he held himself when everything he had leaned on was taken away. He closed the file, stacked the papers into a neat pile, and turned off the lights in the meeting room. In the glass reflection, the same cold lawyer stared back at him, the one journalists called a shark. That evening, he made a decision no one but him yet knew about. He would defend Ed not only because it was an interesting case, he would take a close look at him, at his reactions, at what would be left of this Omega after he went through his own family's court. And if his instincts were right, he would offer a contract that would change them both. In the back of his mind, the thought already sounded clearly. Their stories might end up far more tightly intertwined than the usual lawyer-client pattern. The morning started in the color of wet concrete. The sky over the city hung low and heavy, as if it itself pressed on the courthouse roof. Cameras were already lined up at the entrance, black eyes of lenses, gray tripods, microphones with TV logos. Journalists traded short remarks, glancing again and again at the doors where the main character of the day would soon appear. Ed was led through an internal corridor, away from the main crowd, but even there he felt the smell of other people's curiosity. Court staff pretended to be busy, yet their eyes clung to the escort, to the handcuffs, to his face. He felt not like a person, but like an exhibit they were about to carry into the hall and put on display. A rough metal door opened a little. The guard nodded, letting them through. The large lobby was filled with nervous activity. On the wall hung a huge screen, its ticker repeating the same phrase. High-profile case against a family trader, Omega accountant siphoned off large sums, undermining trust in a respected clan. The word traitor scraped his ears like a dull knife. Ed dropped his gaze to avoid looking at the screen. Inside, everything clenched from shame, even though he still could not connect the numbers, the articles, the label fraudster to himself. It still felt like they were talking about someone else who just happened to wear his name. In the corridor before the courtroom, the journalists were waiting. They were not allowed too close, but it was enough to hear the whisper, Omega. Family. Money. Someone tried to catch his eye, to snatch any emotion. Ed turned away automatically, his shoulders tightening, his steps shortening. The handcuffs clinked on the metal, and that sound seemed louder to him than all the noise around. Leon cut through this chaos like a straight line. He walked into the corridor without hurry, but space subtly adjusted to his pace. The dark suit fit him perfectly. The white shirt seemed too bright against the gray walls. In his hand was a neat folder, not a single extra sheet, no pointless movements, no jittery notes. He did not play at caring. He did not rush to Ed with comforting words, and did not perform a theatrical hand on the shoulder. He gave the escort a quick assessing look, nodded once, and immediately switched to what mattered, the courtroom. On the move, he noted the makeup of the panel of judges, the press seats, the prosecutor's spot, the habits of the clerk already laying out the protocol. All his energy was aimed not at the person, but at the battlefield. And that was honest. On days like this, soft words changed very little. The courtroom met them with heavy, sticky air, a high ceiling, wooden panels, benches for the public. On the front rows sat the press. Behind them, random spectators lucky enough to get seats at a big trial. Further back there was emptiness, because no one from the family had come. The defendant's bench felt like a separate cage. They sat Ed down, took off the handcuffs, but the sense of bars did not go away. His life was now truly inside a rectangle outlined by the judge's table, the prosecutor's desk, and the defense bench. Everything he had was his breathing and the man with the folder standing next to him. Leon laid out the documents on the table as if he were setting up tools, each folder in its place, each file flagged. He glanced at Ed, weighing his condition, but his gaze was not soft. It was clinically precise. The Omega was pale, his fingers shook, his lips pressed into a thin line. Leon noted inwardly, in that state, he would not be able to defend himself at all, which meant Leon would have to cover the whole line for him. It began with formalities. The charges, articles, sums were read out. Phrases like especially large scale, organized scheme, abuse of family trust sounded flat like commands. The prosecutor, a confident man with a trained voice, spoke as if the verdict had already been written and the hearing was a mere formality. The first hour was like a dry lecture, tables, graphs, explanations of the scheme. To the audience and journalists, it might have looked like the boring part of the case. For Leon, this was where his work started. He listened not only to the words, but also to what lay between them. Where the prosecutor felt especially sure of himself, and where, on the contrary, he slid into vague general phrases, which documents they showed immediately and which they only mentioned. Ed, meanwhile, clung to separate phrases like to protruding stones in a fast river. The numbers made his vision dim. The words personal gain squeezed his chest until it hurt. His heart pounded too fast, his palms sweated. More than once he wanted to just stand up and say, I do not understand who you are talking about, but his voice stuck somewhere deep around the solar plexus. When it came to witnesses, the room woke up a bit. The relatives were called first. They were brought in one by one and seated at the stand. They spoke slowly and beautifully. Neat pauses. Proper emphasis. Compassion for the lost boy. Sadness over betrayal. Regret that even family ties are sometimes not enough. If Ed had heard them a few months earlier, he might have once again tried to explain everything away to himself. Find excuses. Hold on to familiar patterns. But now, sitting apart and seeing their profiles turned carefully toward the judges and cameras, he felt only a strange, detached sensation, as if he were watching a play starring people he had once lived with, but with whom he had long ago lost any real connection. Leon stepped in when the pause was ripe. He approached the stand without hurry, adjusted his cuff, glanced at the transcript. There was no forced aggression in his voice, cold politeness, even tone, slightly ironic pauses. He did not need direct quotes for us to see how he worked the cross-examination. He started with simple, obvious questions, dates, sums, general circumstances. The witness answered easily, confidently. Then came a barely visible turn, a clarification that made them go back a couple of years. Recall an old contract. Admit that they had signed authorization for funds transfers themselves, even though now they tried to present themselves as bystanders. Leon methodically pulled out documents the prosecution had carefully skipped, old agreements, internal orders. Corporate emails where the same person now playing the victim gave clear instructions. Run it through Ed's accounts. Do it so it does not appear on the balance sheet. Record as a technical transfer. Each such moment was a small blow to the family myth. On the other side of the room, the prosecutor tried to interfere, objected, asked the court to limit questions to the charges. The judges exchanged glances, made notes. Two kept neutral faces. The third allowed himself a tiny, almost invisible crease at the word technical transfer. For Leon, that was the crack he needed. The medical records episode became especially important. In one folder that court staff had initially submitted as unimportant, Leon found a hospital discharge summary. A few months earlier, Ed had been there with complications after a nervous breakdown. The dates of his stay coincided with the period when several key orders moving funds had allegedly been signed by him in person. Leon slid that sheet quietly under the wall of the accusation. First, he asked the witness if they remembered where Ed had been on that particular day. The witness, without thinking, said, "As usual, in the office." Then Leon produced the discharge and calmly asked them to explain how the Omega could be in intensive care and sign documents in their presence at the same time. The pause that followed could be heard by everyone. The witness stumbled. They started to confuse dates, fall back on memory error, on maybe another day. Leon did not raise his voice. He simply asked one more clarifying question, then another, slowly leading to the obvious. Either Ed had not signed those papers, or the witness was deliberately lying. From one row to another, from one folder to the next, the picture changed. Where the prosecution had painted the Omega as the initiator and coordinator, another figure slowly emerged. A quiet, convenient executor it was easy to hang everything on. The real beneficiaries peeked from behind his back in signatures, orders, instructions. Ed sat and felt something shift inside. His heart still beat too fast. His palms were still damp, but panic now mixed with a foreign, unusual feeling. Detached amazement. Someone was finally saying out loud what he had never allowed himself to fully think. That those strange orders and signatures were not family business, not duty, but a trap. That the trust he had been trained for years to lean on had long stood on the other side. He watched Leon and could not understand why this alpha, who until today had been for him just a name on a folder, was tearing his family's story apart with such cold anger. Not out of pity, not for justice in general. Every move carried a very personal intolerance for such schemes. By midday, the prosecution had clearly lost its earlier confidence. The prosecutor looked down into his papers more often and allowed himself arrogant remarks less often. The judges started asking their own clarifying questions, not only to the defendant, but also to the witnesses for the prosecution, to the gray areas of the scheme no one had touched that morning. After a short break, Leon moved on to the technical part, the financial expert reports. He brought the experts up one by one, checking what data they had relied on, who had supplied them with documents, whether they had seen any originals, whether they had compared signatures. In one case, he showed the expert had not even known that certain contracts existed. In another, that he had been officially told not to analyze particular transactions where the head of the family's personal accounts appeared, dry legal details, which for most people in the room blurred into a long gray stream, formed a disturbing picture for the judges and professionals. The case for the prosecution looked less and less monolithic. Where, that morning, everything seemed simple, the Omega stole, the family suffered. A gray zone opened. When the phrase was finally said that some signatures might have been made by another hand and required handwriting analysis, a light ripple of sound went through the hall. Journalists sat very straight, but their hands already reached for phones. They smelled blood, the smell they lived on. For Ed, everything that was happening was at once too much and not enough. Too much information, numbers, details, too few simple, clear answers. He caught separate words. Forgery, pressure on witnesses, incomplete file. At some point he realized that fear was stepping half a step back, letting in another unfamiliar sensation, as if between him and the edge of the cliff a thin but real wall had appeared. He was still on the defendant's bench. He still carried the label of main accused. He still understood that one wrong turn could cost him many years of his life. But for the first time in this whole story, he felt that his fate did not lie entirely in the hands of those who had always decided everything for him. When the court announced a recess, the room stirred. People rose, moved, began to talk louder. Journalists rushed to the exit, typing on their phones while trying to catch Leon's face. He, gathering his folders, seemed not to notice them at all. He was only interested in the next line of defense. Ed was led back into the corridor. It was a little quieter there, but snippets of phrases still reached him. Unexpected expert report, cracks in the prosecution, family story that did not survive scrutiny. He leaned his back against the cold wall, feeling the tremor in his hands slowly fading. His head still buzzed, but the noise was no longer a solid black mass. Separate notes appeared in it. The prosecutor's voice, thrown off stride by an awkward question, Leon's dry, steady intonation when he said, "This must be checked," the restrained but noticeable change in the chief judge's voice when he asked for additional documents. The world around was still hostile. Cameras were still waiting at the doors. The family was still out there playing the victims. But between Ed and that world now stood a man who was coldly and methodically turning an ironclad case into a field of doubt. And in that crack, between the concrete certainty of the system and reality, for the first time there was room for his own life. The verdict sounded ordinary. No dramatic pause, no heavy emphasis. The judge read it in a dry, tired voice, as if it were just another item on a long agenda. The words formed legal formulas that most people in the room heard only as background. Ed could hardly catch the meaning. He sat there, fingers digging into the edge of the bench, counting his heartbeats. Every new paragraph sounded like another step toward the cliff. Any second now he expected to hear those final words, the term, the article, the number after which every door would slam shut. At some point the judge's voice changed rhythm. Into the record went phrases about insufficient proof of personal gain, about some materials being inadmissible, about the need to separate out episodes involving other people. Somewhere in that block the key line appeared. On the main counts, Ed was found not guilty. He did not understand at once. His mind caught only two sentences. The first, the fraud charge was dropped for lack of proven intent. The second, the measure of restraint in the form of custody was canceled, and the defendant was to be released from the courtroom immediately. "You are free." The phrase was short and almost indifferent. The judge was already moving on to technical issues, the clerk leaning in to clarify something. For the system, it was just another outcome of procedure. For Ed, the world stopped for a second. The air in his lungs felt foreign. His chest did not seem to keep up with this new regime. He stood up carefully, feeling his legs tremble. There were no handcuffs on him anymore, yet his wrists still ached with the phantom weight of metal. Leon stood beside him, gathering papers. Almost nothing changed in his face. No visible relief, no triumph, only the slightest loosening of an inner spring Ed had learned to notice over these days in tiny details. The Alpha gave a brief nod to the court, exchanged formal remarks with the prosecutor, who was already planning an appeal, and only then looked at the Omega. Ed could not even nod back. He only met his eyes, as if checking whether this was really happening. Logic screamed that the nightmare was over. His body refused to believe it. The courthouse corridor met him with flashes. The moment he appeared in the doorway, bright lights slashed his eyes. Camera flashes went off almost simultaneously. Lenses swung toward him like a pack of predators smelling movement. Journalists stepped closer, microphones thrust forward, voices flying at him from all sides. Someone shouted, asking if he felt remorse. Someone demanded a comment on his betrayal of the family. Someone wanted to know how much he had paid for a lawyer like this. The words collided in the air, turning into white noise. Ed stood on the top step and felt that noise pulling him in different directions. In someone's feed, he was already becoming the poor Omega who got framed. In someone else's, a shady lucky one pulled out by an expensive attorney. Somewhere his footage was being cut right now so that only his pale face and Leon's last name in the captions remained in frame. He could almost feel physically how his image was being dragged apart, cut up and rewritten without his involvement. The family did not show up in person. Instead, at the microphones stood a slicked-back beta in a perfect suit, their representative. His voice was flat, like an accounting report. He said the family was shocked by the court's decision, but of course respected the justice system, said they sincerely hoped the Omega would realize the consequences of his actions and find his way to correction, said they bore him no ill will but were forced to distance themselves from such behavior. Inside these sterile constructions, the main point was perfectly clear. They had already rewritten the story. Now he was no longer a criminal, but a lost soul who had fallen under outside influence and broken their generous trust. The phrase, aggressive defense, slipped in as a separate jab at Leon. Ed listened with the edge of his consciousness. Each word hit a nerve, but no longer the way it used to. Something inside had snapped at the deepest level, the level where he used to always try to excuse them. Even now, when the court had officially recognized him as not guilty, they had found a formula where, once again, he was the one at fault. On paper, he was free. In reality, he stood on the stairs with no single clear path ahead. He could not go home. The apartment he had lived in for years legally belonged to the company. The locks there had probably been changed long ago, his keycard deactivated. The box with his personal belongings was sitting somewhere among sealed assets. He had no job. In the business world, rumors traveled faster than any official letter. Even if the acquittal held up and no appeal succeeded, his resume would forever carry a bold note, figure in a high-profile financial case. No sane employer wanted to deal with an Omega whose name would drag toxic discussion along behind it for years. Money. There was nothing on his accounts. Everything he had had was frozen at the investigation stage. A month's salary, a small emergency savings cushion, some old deposits, all of it had gone into the same hole called asset seizure for the duration of the case. No one was in a hurry to lift those restrictions. It turned out there were no friends either. Those who'd been sending sympathetic messages yesterday suddenly stopped answering. Some quietly removed him from their contacts. Some wrote vague posts online about a difficult situation without tagging him. The tone was the same. People were distancing themselves so someone else's scandal would not splash onto them. Freedom with an asterisk looked like a staircase with no steps. He stood there clutching the transparent plastic bag with his belongings from detention. Inside, a wallet with empty cards, an old phone without a SIM, a belt, a watch, a couple of small things. Everything that remained from his previous life fit into that fragile piece of plastic. Leon watched from a little to the side. He did not come over yet, did not push the journalists away, though he could. He did not throw himself between Ed and the cameras. He simply stood there, one hand on the railing, taking in the picture as a whole. He saw an Omega who had just formally won his freedom standing in the wind, gripping that bag as if it could replace a home. Saw his eyes skimming over the square, the faces, the cars, not finding a single point he could walk toward. The system had done its part. It did not send him to prison, but it did not offer him anything in return either. No rehabilitation program, no help-finding work, no back door through which he could leave not under camera fire, but simply as a person. The reputational vacuum turned out to be scarier than a cell. After a while, the noise started to fade. Tired reporters switched to new topics. Cameras were packed away, tripods folded. Someone still tried to throw one last question in Ed's direction, but the voice no longer had the same weight. People were leaving. Cold wind dragged trash bags down the steps, scraps of press releases, forgotten flyers. The gray sky sank even lower. Ed realized that if he stayed here another hour, he would just become part of the scenery, another pathetic figure at the entrance. Leon was the first to move. He did not say, "Let's go," and did not hold out a hand. He simply picked up the folder, adjusted his coat, and headed for the parking lot in the back courtyard. His steps were as controlled as in the morning, only his shoulders now carried another invisible weight. He walked without looking back, as if his decision had been made long ago, not for Ed, but for himself. The Omega stayed on the steps for a few more heartbeats. He watched Leon's back, then the emptying yard, then the street beyond the fence. None of the options looked safe. Beyond the concrete fence lay a city where he had no home, no job, no money, and no people. Walking after the lawyer meant following the only person with whom, over the past weeks, he had been connected by at least one thing, even if purely legal. Where now? The answer was simple in its hopelessness. He took a step. The bag crackled in his hand. His knees shook, but held. Ed went down the remaining stairs, past the empty smoking area, walked through the gate where earlier they had driven him in handcuffs. Now he could walk out on his own, without an escort, but there was not a trace of lightness in that "on his own." Outside, off to the side, the familiar shape of a car flashed, black body, clean line of headlights, a plate he had memorized over short escorted rides. Leon was already standing by the door, opening it, talking on the phone with someone from his team. His voice was still the same, cold and collected. Ed stopped for a second. This short stretch, from the courthouse to the parking lot, felt harder than the whole distance from detention to the courtroom, because now he was walking it without guards, by his own choice. A few seconds later he moved again, not because he fully trusted the Alpha, not because he believed in any happy ending, but because all his old supports had vanished, and this man at least did not pretend to be his brother, father, or benefactor. Leon was exactly what he appeared to be, a predatory professional who had just kept him out of real prison. Freedom with an asterisk meant exactly that. The court let him go, but the world did not extend a single hand, and the only point of reference in this empty space was that cold lawyer, whose car he now walked toward in silence. Leon's office looked like it was ready for a magazine spread on "The Right Kind of Life." High floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, the city below like a glowing model, glass, metal, dark wood, not a single extra thing. No framed photos, no souvenirs, no random books, only neat lines of folders, a strict chair, a perfectly clean desk. Everything here obeyed control. Even the air smelled not of coffee and paper, but of something neutral, sterile, expensive. Ed sat opposite him in a borrowed jacket they had given him at reception, so he would draw less attention as a man just out of detention. The jacket hung on him like a sack. The shirt underneath was wrinkled, the collar rubbed his neck. In the window's reflection, he saw a man with a tired face and empty eyes. That was how defendants looked in news clips he used to see in passing, never thinking he would be one of them. Inside him, a simple, familiar logic was running. Now they would name a number. Maybe huge, maybe with the phrase, "Cases like this are expensive, but I gave you a chance." At best, they would offer installments. At worst, they would politely hint he could sign a promissory note and pay for the rest of his life, if of course he ever found anything to pay with. In his world, nothing had ever come for free. Even family help had always had a price. Leon sat in his chair as if it were part of him. His movements were economical and precise, not a single unnecessary gesture. He did not rush. First, he carefully stacked the case materials into a folder and set it aside, as if that story was already complete. Then he opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Ed tensed, bracing himself to see a familiar thin folder. 1 page, fee clause, signature, amount, due dates. Instead, a thick, heavy binder with a sturdy spine landed on the desk. The label on it read, clearly and simply, "Marriage Contract." For a second, his world lurched. He actually thought it was some mistake, or someone else's file that ended up here by accident. But Leon turned the folder toward him so that the first page faced the Omega. White paper, neat title, standard format, 2 empty fields at the top for the spouses' names. Ed's eyes slid over the text automatically. His mind refused to accept the meaning, but the words were too clear. Term, several years with an option to extend by mutual agreement, place of joint residence, a specific address. Both parties obliged to maintain the outward image of a couple, obligation to live under one roof, to appear together in public when needed, to avoid scandals and actions that could damage reputation. Then came sections packed with numbers. The financial part looked like its own separate universe. Leon took on full support: housing, food, clothing, medical expenses, legal protection. There was a separate clause about paying off all of Ed's current debts related to the case and providing for his safety in the event of aggressive moves by the family, from lawsuits to stalking. It sounded almost like a life raft, but there was a rope tied to it. The second block was where the restrictions began. In the first years, Ed had no right to terminate the contract unilaterally. Any attempt to dissolve the marriage without Leon's consent could trigger penalties described in legal language, but essentially meaning repayment of all funds invested in him, an amount he could never realistically pay back. There was a non-disclosure clause. Ed could not share details of the household, discuss Leon's private matters, or reveal terms of their financial arrangements to third parties. Any public statement that could harm the lawyer's reputation would be treated as a breach. A separate section dealt with work. The Omega had the right to be employed, but any contract would have to be cleared with his spouse. He was forbidden to enter agreements that could create a conflict of interest with Leon's firm or put the household under attack. The clause about personal boundaries stood apart from the overall dryness of the text. It set out that any intimate aspect of their interaction was possible only by mutual consent, without coercion and without using spousal status as pressure. It stated clearly that refusal by one party could not be grounds for sanctions. As he read, a heavy, sticky feeling spread inside. A new cage. Yes, the conditions were very different from the ones he had lived under before. There was no shouting about duty to the family, no moral blackmail, no promises of love and gratitude that later turned into a bill. Everything here was honest. You sign, you enter a system of mutual benefits and limits, but the fact remained. He would once again have to belong to someone in order to survive. Emotions pushed their way up. No. Too much. Too tight. I barely know this man. Flashes of images came with them. Leon in court, icy and untouchable, breaking witnesses with a single question. Leon in the car, driving him silently through the city. Leon at this same desk, laying out his life in paragraphs. But the emotions were quickly forced back by dry cutting arithmetic. He had no money, no apartment, no job, not even a change of clothes beyond what fit into that crackling plastic bag. At any moment his family could file new suits, try to challenge the ruling, block any attempt to get hired. Public opinion was already rolling downhill. Even acquitted people were often viewed as those who just got lucky. Run to another city? He did not even have money for a ticket. Change his last name? In the modern world, that did nothing to erase a digital trail. Disappear and start over from zero. You needed resources to start from zero. He had none. Leon explained his motives without pretty words and without trying to evoke pity. For him, this contract was not a romantic gesture, but a logical solution. Inheritance laws, corporate agreements, and the older partner's wills created a rigid frame for him. To gain control of his share in the firm and a real vote on the board, he needed an official, socially acceptable marriage. Not a purely paper arrangement with the first available candidate, but a union that could withstand the scrutiny of shareholders, regulators, and the press. He had already been offered other options. Contracts with alphas ready for a formal marriage for status, with betas from proper families, with omegas, someone considered suitable matches. In all those schemes, he saw the same flaw. People willing to play a role switched masks too easily when the stakes went up. Ed had appeared in front of him not as a candidate, but as a byproduct of other people's greed and betrayal, an omega the family had sold without hesitation to save its business. A man stripped of everything, now forced to weigh any chance at safety. Leon saw in that not only a tragedy, but a point where their interests matched. He needed a partner who was just as invested in preserving the agreement as he was. Someone who would have something real to lean on in this union, not an emotion and not a pretty story, but clear written clauses. He did not promise love, did not say, everything will be okay, did not swear to shield him from every possible harm. He described a structure. You give me a marriage, I give you a shield, legally, financially, day to day. That was it. When he finished, the office fell quiet again. Outside, evening lights were slowly coming on, the city turning into a mesh of glowing lines. Cars moved down below. Life went on as if no trial had taken place that day. Ed was left alone with the folder. Leon walked out, leaving him in the room with the text like clients are left alone in a meeting room with a contract to think it over. The door closed softly. The silence grew thicker. Ed's hands were shaking. His fingers slid over the signature lines. The ink in the pen seemed more dangerous than any knife. To sign meant to accept that his life for the next few years would be tied to another man's name, another man's apartment, another man's rules. Not to sign meant to walk out that door into the night where only cold air and an empty account waited for him. His first impulses were simple, almost childish. Get up, leave the folder, say no, and walk out without the slightest idea where to go. Keep at least that tiny shred of freedom he still had, the right not to put his name under a new cage. But outside, it was getting dark. In the city lights, the same news segments were already reflecting. His face under the caption, Defendant. His name had already spread through feeds, forums, chats. He could not erase it, could not pretend this was just a bad dream. He remembered all the contracts he had had in his life before this, the employment contract written so he could be fired at any time without explanation. Unspoken family agreements, where endless gratitude was demanded in exchange for the mere fact they had taken him in. Documents he had signed for his relatives without reading because we are family. Not one of those agreements had been in his favor. Here, among the harsh formulations and limits, there were points that worked for him. Safety, protection, a roof over his head, a chance not to fall into a black void after the acquittal. He had never thought the scariest choice would not be prison or freedom, but freedom on a cold street or dependence with clearly defined borders. The folder lay in front of him, heavy as a new sentence. But somewhere beneath the layer of fear, another thought was slowly rising. For the first time in his life, he had a chance to enter an agreement where he was not just an object, but an actual side. The evening he left Leon's office with the folder under his arm felt strangely empty. The city lived as usual. Lights, cars, people with shopping bags, someone talking into a phone. For him, it all became background noise, like cheap headphones white noise. None of it had anything to do with him anymore. He no longer called any place home. The apartment he used to live in was listed under the company. The entry system blocked him the moment he was arrested. When, out of habit, he tried to punch in his door code, the panel answered with a dry red light of refusal, like it had never known him. The relatives had shut the doors of their big house even earlier. His key had stopped turning in that lock long before the warrant. Leon understood this. He did not suggest taking Ed to his own place, did not pretend there was a simple solution. Instead, he gave an order, and the car turned toward a business-class apart-hotel where the lobby smelled of coffee, cleaning agent, and expensive carpeting. Reception was already prepared. The paperwork had been done in advance. The room was paid for. In the guest field, there was only Ed's first name, no last name. The room greeted him with silence and neutrality. A small space with a neat bed, one armchair, a desk by the window. Beige walls, neutral curtains, a generic picture of a blurred landscape that could have hung in any city in the world. Not a single thing said, "Someone lives here." On the desk lay the contract folder he had carried this whole time, hugging it to his chest like something too heavy but also fragile. Next to it, a single-use electric kettle, 2 packets of cheap tea, a plastic cup. On the bed, on top of the blanket, a spare one was neatly folded. That was all. This temporary room felt like a corridor between lives, not a destination, but no man's land where he was allowed to pause for one night before he said yes or no to the version of the future he had been offered. He He put the folder on the desk, still closed, and for some time just walked around counting steps. From door to window, 10. From window to bed, 4. From bed to bathroom, 7. His body still acted as if he were in a cell. You must know the space, know how to move in the dark, know where the corners are, where the door is, where danger might appear. Eventually, he still came back to the desk, sat down, opened the cover. The papers smelled of ink and expensive stock. These sheets felt different from what he had signed before at the family firm. There, documents appeared ready-made. They slid the right page under his hand, left only the signature line visible, and told him it was just technical, internal reports. Everyone does it. He had never had the right to ask. Here, the text lay in front of him in full. Leon had not rushed him, had not turned the pages for him, had not covered any awkward paragraph with his finger. For the first time in his life, someone with power over him had not said, "Just sign." The inner defense mechanisms still kicked in. His eyes wanted to skim fast and shallow. His brain whispered that it was all too complicated anyway, that lawyers always win and he would just be wasting energy. He forced himself to read slowly. First came the general provisions. Parties to the marriage, term, several years, subject to extension, a list of circumstances in which the contract would automatically be revised, legal language, cold, predictable, almost emotionless. Then sections about shared living, public image, events. Those lines sent a thin chill under his skin. To live under the same roof as an alpha he had known for only a few weeks, even if that alpha had just kept him out of prison. To share space. To remember constantly that every time they stepped out together, it was not just a walk, but part of a game in which he had a role. Then, the financial obligations. Here, oddly, the fear eased a little. For the first time, he saw a text that literally stated, "The other party is obliged to provide housing, to cover his current debts, to pay for treatment if needed, to protect him from new lawsuits from the family, to block attempts to use his name in fresh schemes." Ed felt an exhausted, almost bitter smile twitch at the corner of his mouth. His entire life had taught him one thing: power is always a right, never a duty. Here, another person's power over him was also framed as a set of clear, enforceable obligations. If Leon broke the contract, at least in theory, Ed would have something to lean on. He turned the page. Restrictions. No unilateral divorce in the first years, a line that made his breath catch. It meant that even if he wanted to run, simply leave and slam the door, he would not be able to. The law would stand behind the contract, not his emotions. He would once again be bound, this time formally, not just by moral blackmail as before. The non-disclosure clause. No talking about the household, internal contracts, personal matters. After a family that had dragged out whatever suited them and locked the rest away, the very idea of silence repelled him. And yet there was some symmetry here. Silence was required not only from him. Leon was binding himself too, with a promise not to use his story against him. His eyes caught on the section that spent an oddly large amount of attention on personal boundaries. In a dry legal text, this felt out of place. Any intimacy only by mutual agreement, no sanctions for refusal, no pressure based on spousal status, the right to set your boundaries at any point. Ed remembered how many times in his life he had heard, "You are an omega, this is your duty. No one will tiptoe around you, be grateful anyone even looks at you." And for some reason, these lines in the contract hit old Bruce's hardest. He understood that romantic expectations in this construct were dangerous. This was not an offer of love, not a fairy tale rescue. Leon was not some noble knight riding up to tear him from a tower. This was an exchange. His freedom, his name, his presence, his body as part of a successful alpha's image, in return for protection, resources, a place under a roof no one else could give him. The alternatives did not look like one life or another. They looked like a drop into the void. The family had already made it clear they would not leave him alone. They could file new claims, demand moral damages, send him the bill for years of support. They could leak his personal data online, turn his life into a hunt. They could spread rumors in circles where an omega without backing quickly became prey. Without protection, he was a target. With the contract, he was dependent, but covered. The night in the apart-hotel brought him no sleep. He tried to lie with his eyes closed, but his body clung to old reflexes. He heard every sound through the wall. Footsteps, elevator chime, muffled TV in a neighboring room. Instead of concrete cell walls, he had thin partitions. Instead of a metal door with a peephole, an electronic lock. The essence did not change. He was still in a temporary shelter from which he had to either walk out into nowhere or step toward the contract. Toward morning, he dozed off for a short while. He woke with a jerk, convinced someone was calling him to interrogation. It took a few seconds to remember where he was. Then it all came back. The trial, the acquittal, the folder, the hotel. He went to the narrow bathroom mirror. There he saw a man with hollow cheeks, red eyes, a mouth that had forgotten how to relax, not a younger member of a respected family, not the accused, not even the happily saved one, just someone who had no extra life left. A simple, brutal thought came to him. He had nothing left to lose, except that part of himself that still believed if he played small and quiet enough, the storm would pass him by. He turned on the kettle, drank a plastic cup of hot water instead of tea, put the folder into the cheap bag they had given him in detention for his belongings, shrugged on his jacket, left the room as if afraid he might change his mind if he stayed another minute. Leon's office met him with the same cold calm. No questions in the lobby, just a brief nod from the assistant. The elevator took him up, corridor-door, the same office with panoramic windows, the same view of a city where other people's lives went on according to plan. Leon sat at the desk as if nothing had changed, in the same polished calm. He did not offer Ed a seat, just gave a slight nod toward the chair, and the Omega sank into it automatically. The folder was back on the table between them. That heavy stripe of paper divided the room into two halves. There was nothing ceremonial in this moment, no phrases about destiny, no performance. The lawyer did not ask if he was sure, did not press, did not throw in last-minute arguments. It was clear he believed the decision had been made long before Ed stepped through the door. The pen lay beside it, simple, expensive, weighty. Ed picked it up, and the metal was unexpectedly warm, as if someone had just held it. He had to sign several pages. On the first, where their names would stand side by side, he wrote his own name slowly, carefully, as if afraid to make a mistake in the only thing that still belonged to him. His hand shook. Inside, he felt how, in that thin line of ink, everything that had tied him to his old life dissolved, not just legally, but symbolically. He was saying goodbye not only to the house he had grown up in, and not only to the last name they would happily reclaim once it stopped being convenient. He was saying goodbye to the role he had played his whole life, the role of a quiet, convenient Omega who always followed someone else's will, asked no questions, signed without reading and agreed without discussion. Outwardly, he was doing the same thing, putting his signature down, but the qualitative difference was huge. For the first time, he was consciously choosing dependence. He was not falling into it because he saw no other options. He was looking at its shape and saying, yes, let it be this way, as long as this step is mine. Each signature under a separate section echoed like a dull blow somewhere inside. I agree to the living arrangements. I accept the financial obligations of the second party. I confirm the voluntary nature of entering this marriage. The legal phrase, by mutual consent, had to be there, and strangely, it was starting to sound less empty to him. When all the fields were filled, Leon pulled the folder toward himself. He took the pen and signed beside Ed's name. He did it calmly, without hesitation, like someone who had long ago decided and was only completing the formalities. Two names now stood together, two signatures, one sharp and confident, like a shot, the other slightly trembling, but still carried through to the end. On that sheet of paper, two lives collided, brought together not by a romantic chance encounter on the street, but by hard pressure from wills, corporate rules, elder greed, and the bare need to survive. It was a moment that could not be rewound. Even if one day they both regretted it, even if their paths diverged, that thin line of ink would remain, in archives, in registries, in their personal histories, a point after which the old scripts no longer worked. Ed felt a strange, conflicting tug in his chest. The fear had not gone anywhere, but mixed into it was a faint, barely audible note, the sense that maybe for the first time he had pulled the lever that set his own life in motion. The move itself was quiet. No boxes, no movers, no familiar chaos. His whole old life fit into one suitcase and a folder of documents. The rest remained behind, with keys that no longer opened anything. The car pulled up to Leon's house at dusk. This was not the older family's mansion, and not the glass tower where the office sat. The house stood slightly away from the main streets, with a facade of smooth stone and dark glass. No flashy details, no guards on display. On the outside, it looked like just another expensive modern home, behind which lived a man who had built his entire world on control. Inside, it looked like an architecture magazine had come to life and reshaped itself for one person. A spacious hallway, high ceilings, cool built-in lights, furniture, only as much as function required, a sofa made for sitting, not for photos, a table you could both work and eat at without changing the setting. No family photos on the walls, no children's drawings, no travel souvenirs. Leon's personal things were hidden in closed cabinets. What caught the eye were only lines, planes, colors. Ed crossed the threshold and felt not like a guest, but like a random visitor in a museum. Every object seemed foreign and complete, as if it were an exhibit you shouldn't touch without permission. Even the air was different. Dry, slightly cool, with a faint smell of cleaning agents and expensive tobacco that clearly hadn't been lit here in a long time. Leon didn't give him a tour. He just pointed the way, named the floor and the door. Ed had enough life experience to understand. He was being given space to figure things out on his own, without commentary. His room wasn't tucked away deep inside the house like a guest room for a temporary visitor. It was in a separate wing, next to the office and a small library. The door opened with a regular handle, no code lock. Inside was a tidy space with everything necessary and nothing extra. A normal-sized bed with neutral sheets, a desk by the window, big enough to spread out documents or a laptop, a couple of tall, empty shelves waiting for books or folders, a wardrobe where his few clothes clung to one corner, the rest yawned with fresh emptiness. No artwork on the walls, just smooth, pale surfaces that told nothing about the owner's past or the tenant's future. It wasn't a corner to temporarily stash someone. It was the personal room from the contract, a private space where he could close the door and be alone. That made it both easier and harder at the same time. He walked around, checked how the door shut, how the switches worked, how his footsteps sounded on the floor. The sound was soft, muffled. There wasn't that ringing emptiness he remembered from the oversized living rooms of his family's house. Leon's home was cold, but not echoing, more like focused, collected. The first evening passed in awkward logistics mode. Leon gave short instructions, where the kitchen was, where the bathroom was, where the laundry area was. He drew boundaries, what rooms were common, which were work zones, where it was better not to go without a reason. No commanding tone, no attempt to underline his power, just a clear, businesslike list. To Ed, it felt like he had joined a new department in a big company and now had to quickly learn the internal rules so he wouldn't get in the way. Only this time the company was one person and the house that was his extension. Mornings in this house ran on a schedule. The coffee machine turned on at almost the same time every day. In the kitchen you could hear the knife on a cutting board, the rustle of paper, the quiet ping of phone notifications. Leon would appear in a perfectly pressed shirt, composed, rested, his head already inside the upcoming day. He didn't ask how Ed had slept or poke into his business. He just gave a short nod that acknowledged they were sharing the same table. Breakfasts didn't turn into warm family scenes, no smiles across the table, no long talks about plans. But something else appeared, predictability. Ed quickly understood what he could count on: food, silence, and no draining small talk early in the morning when his head was still foggy and his body still remembered the cell. During the day, Leon disappeared into his schedule. Meetings, court, negotiations filled his time until late evening. The house reacted almost physically to his leaving. It became a little quieter, a little less pulled together, as if it loosened its belt. Ed stayed alone, with a kind of emptiness he wasn't ready for. At the family company, his days had always been packed, Accounts, reports, checking documents, urgent errands, the worn-out voices of relatives on the phone demanding, "Recalculate this right now." Here, no one hovered over him. No one told him what had to be done by the end of the day. No one, except the contract itself, had any active demands. He moved through the house carefully, like through a strange forest. He found a small room with books, strict legal tomes, judges' biographies, collections of cases. He stopped at a window that looked out over the city, not from skyscraper height, but a little off to the side, at a level where the lights didn't press down on you, just scattered softly. New, imperfect rituals started to appear in his everyday life. Sometimes he had breakfast with Leon. Sometimes he came later and ate alone, hearing the dishwasher wash away the traces of someone else's morning. Sometimes he lingered in the kitchen, learning to cook simple things so he wouldn't feel completely useless. Washing dishes felt almost like a luxury, an action with an immediate visible result. Evenings, when they both ended up back at home, differed only in how tired they were. Leon often came later, smelling of street, office, and courtroom glass. He changed into more casual clothes without losing his inner discipline. Even in a simple t-shirt, he still looked composed, down to his fingertips. By then, Ed usually had already checked the news, caught a few headlines about the scandalous marriage of the cold lawyer, and quietly muted the sound. Sometimes they ate dinner together, sometimes separately, in silence or with brief exchanges of facts. In this dry routine lay the important part. Leon did not invade without asking. He didn't knock on Ed's door late at night to check up on him, didn't demand to see his messages, didn't brush his shoulder as he walked past. Physical distance was kept almost pedantically. Ed noted this with both relief and anxiety. Relief, because their clause about boundaries was turning out to be real. Anxiety, because this cold correctness left no familiar hooks. He wasn't being humiliated, pressured, or guilt-tripped, and he had no idea how to behave in the absence of all that. Every experimental step felt like a betrayal of his old scripts. Was he allowed to just sit in the living room with a book if the owner was there too? Was he allowed to speak first? About the weather, the news, anything? Every action went through a burning internal check. Is this overstepping? Is this asking too much? Is this how you become a burden again? At the same time, he couldn't help but see how demanding Leon was. First of all, toward himself. The lawyer's desk was never buried in papers, even though dozens of cases passed through his hands. By evening, his things always returned to their places. His phone went off at the same time so the house would be free of outside voices at night. Even the shoes in the entryway stood as if each pair had received individual instructions. The outside world reacted exactly as you'd expect. At the firm, senior partners kept their masks of neutral respect, but the whispers in the corridors were loud enough for even the inattentive to hear. Some were genuinely surprised. Why would a brilliant alpha, who could choose any impeccable partner, marry an omega whose name had just been in the news as that of an accused criminal? Others, more cynical, spun theories about hidden agendas and extra levers of influence built into the marriage. Leon's distant relatives showed up with rare phone calls where standard congratulations and polite phrases carried thin barbs. A flower delivered with no name and an unsigned card. Bold. "Hope you don't regret it." A line from an aunt overheard by Ed as he passed the office door. An omega with that kind of scandal is a time bomb. The press got a new storyline and had no intention of letting it go. Some photographer quickly figured out the address. Vans with TV cameras started appearing outside the gates. News blurbs used the same frames over and over. Leon in a dark coat getting out of the car. Beside him, Ed in a new jacket he hadn't had time to grow into. Headlines were predictable. Cold lawyer bets on Omega with a murky past, marriage of convenience or real feelings, toy or ally. Ed found himself in a new zone of discomfort. Earlier, his invisibility had hurt, but at least it was familiar. Now every walk from the house to the car was a tiny performance. Lenses hunted not his thoughts, but his appearance. Too pale, too tense, too quiet. Social media debated whether he was on the same level as the cold alpha, whether such an omega deserved to stand beside a man like that, or if he was just a temporary diversion. Those comments made him want to hide deeper than any prison wall ever had. In the detention center, at least, there was a shared reality without a storm of other people's opinions. Here, his very existence had become fuel, something to argue about, something to sell, something to build careers on. Despite all that, the house stayed relatively neutral territory. Behind the thick curtains, camera flashes turned into occasional weak flashes, the glass muffled street noise. Inside, there were only two steady sounds, Leon's footsteps and Ed's own breathing. One evening, after deleting yet another batch of gossip and seeing the news shift its focus to a different scandal, Ed stopped by the huge living room window. The city below hummed in its usual rhythm. Headlights slid along the highway, billboards flickered in the distance, antennas rotated slowly on rooftops. Down there, people still lived for whom his name was just a line in the news, a reason for a quick comment, a convenient story about the powerful and the weak. Between him and that noise lay glass, and a man tied to him not by blood and not by love, but by a contract printed on thick paper. It was a strange, fragile feeling of safety, so unfamiliar that his body didn't know how to respond. The cold house hadn't become home in the way romance stories describe it, but within its walls no one demanded he be convenient, perfect, or endlessly grateful. Here they only expected one thing from him, that he fit into the structure without breaking it, and maybe within this cold formula there was finally room to build something alive for himself. The war didn't start with an explosion, it started with a rustle. First came small notes in niche outlets, anonymous comments from sources close to the family, articles with carefully placed emphasis. They didn't call Ed a fraud outright, that would have been too crude, and the court had already spoken. They used other labels, an Omega with a controversial reputation, a figure surrounded by many unanswered questions. The family's surname, in contrast, sounded smooth and respectable. Respected people, successful entrepreneurs, victims of strange coincidences, and ambitious outsiders who had supposedly snatched control from their hands. One site put out a long piece on how ungrateful younger relatives ruin older generations' businesses. The text included familiar details, mention of a trusted accountant who handled the funds at his own discretion. The name wasn't written, but anyone who had followed the case could connect the dots. At first, Ed read it like an outsider. The words slid off the screen like someone else's story. Only slowly did it sink in that this wasn't just noise, it was work, a deliberate campaign where every line was meant to give the narrative back to those who had lost it. Soon, the heavier artillery moved in. The family hired high-profile lawyers and PR people. Statements followed about revisiting the case, about new testimony, about the real picture still not being heard. They filed complaints over the court's decisions, looked for loopholes in the wording, insisted the Omega was now manipulating public opinion through a convenient marriage to an alpha lawyer. Around the same time, another front woke up, one Ed wouldn't have even thought to watch. Inside the firm where Leon held a key position, there were plenty of people who saw him not only as a colleague, but as a rival. His marriage meant the will's condition had been fulfilled, and his voting rights on the board were secure. For those who had hoped for a different balance of power, that was a serious blow. Whispers spread about the odd choice of heir. Some said he was risking not only his own reputation, but that of the firm by tying its name to an Omega recently involved in a criminal case. Others claimed the marriage was only one piece of a more dangerous scheme meant to reassign shares. Ed felt this pressure even without walking through the firm's doors. He heard it in Leon's voice when he came home later than usual, that thin, dry irritation in his tone, not anger at Ed, anger at how easily people turned any human story into a tool. Meanwhile, attacks on the Omega himself kept spreading. Old photos started surfacing online, family holidays in the big house where he stood in the background, almost out of frame, now zoomed in, cut out, captioned with nasty comments. Someone leaked fragments of old chats where he politely thanked relatives for their support. Those lines were ripped out of context and presented as proof of hypocrisy or calculating behavior. Old acquaintances began reappearing almost simultaneously in his messages. People who hadn't called or written in years suddenly missed him. They suggested meeting up just to talk. We're still friends, right? Between the lines, it was clear. They were curious what his life looked like now, what the lawyer's house was like from the inside, and whether they could use him as a shortcut to a profitable contact. Each message sent a familiar shiver through his body. He saw the same pattern: smiles, requests, promises. Only now what they wanted wasn't his signature on documents, but access to his powerful husband. Leon responded to all this in his own way. Outwardly, he remained the same cold professional whom people knew better than to question about his personal life. At work, he tightened the defenses, hired private investigators to trace leak sources, told junior lawyers to draft responses to the family's complaints, and built a separate shield against any attempt to reopen the case. His orders were clear, emotionless, but behind them lay the fatigue of someone who knew. A case that was formally closed was being dragged back into play. At home, he didn't dramatize or unpack everything out loud, but small changes gave him away. His movements sometimes became sharper than usual. He set his mug down a bit too hard, making the china ring. His voice took on a hard edge whenever he said the family's name or mentioned certain partners who were particularly active in the shadows. Ed saw this and felt a paradoxical kind of guilt. He was being used as a weapon again. Only now there was someone else standing on his side of the line. Every new leak, every motion to the authorities, every article hit not only him, but the man whose name now stood beside his on the marriage contract. His old trauma, though, followed its usual script. No matter how many times Leon repeated that he would handle the legal front, no matter how many times his actions backed those words, Ed carried another picture in his head. He would be put back at the center of the target, and then the hand holding the shield would be pulled away. He started listening to the house like to a living mechanism. He tracked changes in the noise, noted how the phone rang more often now, how the light in the office stayed on later at night, how sometimes the silence felt so dense and heavy that it made him want to retreat to his room and lock the door, this time by his own choice. At some point, the attack spilled out beyond articles and whispers. One morning, a different sound filled the house, not reporters outside the gate, not the hum of the coffee machine, the metallic click of the front door and heavy, firm steps in the hallway. Leon rose from his desk before the intercom chimed. The security system kept him informed of every visitor. A courier walked into the office escorted by a security guard, carrying a carefully sealed folder, the kind of seal you only see on official documents. On the first page, in bold type, stood a familiar word: summons. Ed, standing in the doorway a little to the side out of habit, felt cold sweat break out along his spine. He knew these envelopes. Once, they had changed his whole life. Leon didn't rip it open on the spot. He thanked the courier with a brief nod, waited for the door to close, and only then carefully tore the thick paper. The sheets rustled softly as he turned them, skimming the first lines. The silence lasted long enough for the air itself to grow heavy. The summons called them to court for a new process. The plaintiffs were the representatives of Ed's family and a group of minor partners in the firm. The subject grabbed the eye, challenging the good faith of the marriage, checking for a sham union, suspicion of bypassing the will's conditions, and possible collusion to gain illegal control over assets. The list of defendants included not only the older relatives whose schemes had surfaced in the first case. There was another name. Leon's is the key figure who had used the marriage to strengthen his position, and right next to it, Ed's, as part of a suspicious construction. Their enemies had finally achieved what they'd been pushing toward since day one. They had dragged the union out of gossip territory and into the legal arena. Now it wasn't just journalists and neighbors debating who was using whom. A court would. The folder lay on the desk, a heavy rectangle. The lines of text were even and impersonal, but Ed read them differently. In them, he saw not just legal language, but a pattern that was painfully familiar. Once again, his life was being used as a convenient battlefield. Only this time there was a crack in that old pattern. Now, when the next blow came in the form of a summons, he was not standing alone. On one page, the opposing sides were families, clans, partners. On another, two names linked by a marriage contract and a shared dubious decision. Cracks were forming not only in the public concrete facade, they were showing up inside too, in beliefs, in the old habit of being a victim, in predictable roles, and how they handled this new war now would decide more than just whether Leon kept his share in the firm and whether Ed kept his fragile new life. It would decide whether their union stayed a legal construct or became something that could survive not just camera flashes but legal blows as well. The new lawsuit didn't just add another folder to an already big stack, it pulled the foundation out from underneath. Legal routine covered the house like a thick layer: calls, meetings, risk charts, timelines for hearings. For Leon, this was familiar territory. He took apart the wording, built defense lines, cut out weak arguments like a surgeon trimming excess tissue. But this time the strike hit more than his professional reputation. They were questioning something that had felt like his private domain, his choice, his marriage, his right to decide who he lived with. The paradox was that Leon himself had long treated this marriage as a tool, a contract, a ticked box in a will, a convenient solution to several problems at once. But when documents signed by other hands described their bond as a sham union concluded to circumvent the law, something inside him shifted. The wording was too familiar, too much like phrases he'd seen in other cases. Workdays turned into a chain of meetings. In the evenings, the house filled with the dry voices of partners, lawyers, inheritance experts. They spoke his language: percentages, clauses, precedents. They discussed which documents to dig up, which witnesses to prepare, which lines of attack the opposition might use. Ed's role in these conversations was mostly presence. He sat in the corner, pretending to read while his eyes kept drifting to the charts and schemes on the screen. At one point, a partner tossed off a casual remark about the human factor, clearly meaning him. Leon didn't even twitch, but Ed shrank inside. The human factor. That's what they used to call anything that complicated a clean deal. The tension didn't only build outside, it started leaking through tiny gaps in Leon's control. One evening, after yet another overlong meeting, Leon, closing the door behind the last partner, leaned his forehead against the cold metal for a second. The gesture was so out of character that the security guard automatically looked away, as if he had seen something he had no right to see. Ed noticed from the hallway, not because he was snooping, simply because any glitch in the alpha's behavior echoed through the house like a micro-crack in concrete. That same night, he saw for the first time what lay behind the polished facade. Leon's office was the inner sanctum, not locked, but separated from the rest of the house by an invisible line. Ed went in only when asked to bring documents, leave coffee, pass something along. This time he stepped in to grab a tablet Leon had left on the windowsill. On the desk, among neatly stacked folders, lay a thin frame. Usually it stayed in the lower drawer under a pile of contracts, but now it had been taken out and left in view, as if by accident. In the photo there were two people: a young Leon, without the usual steel mask yet, looking awkward in his shirt, and beside him an Omega Ed didn't know, smiling far too openly for this house, leaning on the Alpha's shoulder as if the entire world naturally rested on that contact. The corner of the frame was slightly cracked, as if it had once been thrown or squeezed too hard. Ed didn't touch it. He just stood there, while the weight of someone else's past uncurled its shoulders in the room. For a second, he thought he could hear faint ghosts of voices, laughter, argument, the rustle of papers that did not yet contain the word will. But instead of sound came facts. Later, when he happened to notice the name of an old case in an open archive, another piece fell into place. A high-profile case years ago, where Leon had defended an Omega, accusing a powerful family of abuse and coercion, a case he lost. The Omega disappeared from the professional scene soon after, and later from public life altogether. No details, just a couple of short notes in old databases and one line in the lawyer's bio. Sole defeat in a major case. Ed didn't ask, but now the cold logic with which Leon handled marriage and emotions looked different. Not like an inborn trait, but like armor forged over an old burn. Leon himself didn't rush to talk either, but the new wave of lawsuits forced him to pull out files he'd rather have left buried, among them the folder from that same old case. When a junior lawyer mixed up the desks and left it on the kitchen island, Ed saw the familiar surname on the cover and understood this was no coincidence. That evening, when the house was quiet and the noise of negotiations had faded into a distant hum on speakerphone, something happened between them they had both been avoiding, a direct, if brief, conversation about what came before. Not a confession and not therapy, more like a necessary clarification of facts they couldn't move forward without. Leon, worn down to that state where strength leaves not only your muscles but your usual defenses, spoke sparingly about how, in his family, marriages had never been about choice, about how, when he was young, he once tried to take a step aside from the script, got involved with an Omega who fit neither in status nor in surname, about how the family used that feeling as a lever to push him back into the right cage. He never used the word love, but the silence that followed his line, "Back then I still thought private life could exist separately from contracts," was louder than any confession. Ed listened, feeling something too familiar stir inside him, the same pattern in a different wrapping. There, an alpha's right to choose was crushed by hitting the Omega he loved. Here, an Omega's right to choose had been taken by turning him into a placeholder and a shield for the family business. He didn't try to comfort him, didn't say, "I understand." He hated that phrase when others had thrown it at him. Instead, after a while, he shared pieces of his own story, not his entire biography, not a pile of tragic scenes, just a few points he was most ashamed of. Like the first time, as a teenager, he clearly saw a forged document and kept quiet, not because he didn't understand, because he was terrified of losing even the small place he had in the family. How he convinced himself the elders know better and signed where he should have refused. How whenever his conscience tried to surface, a heavy hand came down in the form of, "You owe us." These words were harder than any legal statement in court, but at some point it became clear that they weren't just trading facts, they were showing each other their weak points, the ones enemies would aim for first. That mutual vulnerability didn't magically make them closer in a romantic sense. There was no scene where one of them rushed in for a hug and promised everything would be different now. If anything, an awkward silence usually followed. Each of them went back to their room, worked out the tension on tasks, cases, familiar rituals, but another layer settled in the foundation of their union, one you could never write into a marriage contract. Meanwhile, the legal battles only intensified. The opponents had built a simple but powerful line. If they could prove the marriage was for inheritance and influence only, with no real marital bond, they could declare it a sham. That would void the will's condition, push Leon away from the board, and put every agreement about Ed's protection at risk. They used everything: analysis of their public appearances, testimony from staff, old photos where Leon was always alone, even the pattern of who came home, when and how long they stayed in the same room. Their lawyers tried to assemble a different picture from all that, a cold alpha signing a marriage contract with a convenient Omega to tick a box in the will, now struggling with the consequences and looking for a way to rewind. They didn't realize how close they were to the truth. That was exactly how it had begun. Only reality had moved on while they tried to prove it on paper. Ed felt the outside pressure seeping in through the smallest openings. Comments online about a fake couple hurt now, not just because they doubted his motives. They hit the part of him that had started to get used to the house, to the rhythms, to Leon's presence not as a contract term, but as a constant. One day, sorting another stack of printouts into folders, he caught himself on a ridiculous thought. He was more offended not at being called bought, but at the fact that no one even allowed for the possibility that something real might have grown between them, as if the whole world had agreed to see only calculation. Leon, on his side, ran into a different threat. Inside the firm, voices demanding transparency became louder. He was invited to closed-door meetings where he was politely but insistently asked to explain how stable this marriage was and whether it could be factored into long-term planning. Behind the gentle phrasing, there was one thing. They were searching for a reason to strike. At one of these meetings, a senior partner dropped a line that cut through even Leon's usual armor. He said that if the union turned out to be sham, the firm would be forced to distance itself to avoid sharing reputational risk. In plain language, they'd make Leon the scapegoat if anything went wrong. That evening, he came home later than usual and didn't switch on the light in the hall. He just sat down on a stair step and stared into the dark for a long time. The house was filled with that dense silence you only get in places where people think more than they talk. Ed came down a few minutes later. Not because he had heard something specific, more because he felt the air change, the way it does before a storm. He didn't ask questions, didn't ask what the partners had said or what new documents had arrived. He just sat on the step below, leaving a small gap between their shoulders. That was enough to turn indifferent emptiness into shared quiet. In that moment, it became painfully clear to both. If they held on only to the letter of the contract, to signatures and stamps, the system would tear them apart. A contract could be voided, a will reinterpreted, a share redistributed. Anything based only on paper could be destroyed by different paper. One thing remained that could not be challenged in court, but on which everything else depended. The answer to a question they had both avoided phrasing: who were they to each other, really? Not in press releases, not in hearing transcripts, not in dry board reports. In that inner place where the roles of lawyer and client, alpha and omega, advantageous marriage and shady deal ended. They were still far from a real answer. There were hearings ahead, reviews, maybe another loud trial. But in this 9th chapter, among files, lawsuits, and old photos, one thing became obvious. Pointing at the marriage contract alone was no longer enough, and if they didn't decide that question for themselves, honestly, without illusions and self-deception, no legal skill would save them from other people's greed or their own unresolved pain. This morning offered no illusions. It began right away as the kind of day when something would either set in place or crack for good. The courthouse looked the same as when Ed had faced prison, but the meaning of those walls had changed. Back then, he had walked in here as a man accused of financial crimes. Now he came as part of a union others wanted to declare fake. On paper, it was about a marriage. In reality, it was about the right to his own version of a life. There were cameras at the entrance again. Journalists who had already memorized Leon's surname now knew the Omega's face as well. Someone shouted questions, trying to catch even a shadow of emotion. The lenses also picked up both families. Ed's relatives standing off to the side with carefully staged, offended dignity. And closer to the stairs, the stiff, closed figures of Leon's family lawyers. Ed felt the air in front of the courthouse vibrating with crossing looks and whispers. Everyone had come for their own reason. Some wanted scandal, some wanted a precedent, some wanted confirmation of their prejudices. No one had come for the truth itself. Inside, almost nothing had changed since the last time. Marble floor, the smell of paper and cheap coffee, guards at the metal detectors. Only his status was different. He was not being led in handcuffs. No one held him by the elbow. He walked on his own, next to Leon. That next to felt strangely heavy. Every movement, every breath was being tracked by dozens of eyes. The courtroom was full. In the front rows sat the family representatives, a little farther back the press, lawyers, and competitors whose interests depended on the outcome. Off to the side were the firm's employees, for whom Leon's marriage was not only their boss's private drama, but also a factor in future votes. They seated Ed next to the defense team. A table, a glass of water, a stack of documents he now almost knew by heart, even though he was not a lawyer. Opposite sat the people whose surnames he had once entered in reports under close relatives. Now they were listed as plaintiffs and interested parties. The claim itself was simple. They wanted the court to invalidate the marriage, arguing it had been concluded only to secure control over a share in the legal firm and to avoid the consequences of the criminal case. On top of that came references to lack of signs of real family life and double benefit for both parties. The plaintiffs opened the case. Their representative spoke in a flat voice, but every phrase carried careful accusation. He walked through the timeline. Leon and Ed meeting through the criminal case, the quick execution of the marriage contract right after the reading of the will, Ed's change of residence, his financial dependence on the Alpha. Then came the details. There was a cold satisfaction in the man's voice, the tone of someone who believed he held the trump cards. Messages where legal conditions of the marriage were discussed. Dates of court hearings on the fraud case matching the date of the contract signing. Testimony from people willing to say, for a fee, that Ed had always dreamed of easy money and was looking for a rich partner even before his arrest. Each new argument stung like a small needle. From time to time, the screen showed fragments of documents, excerpts from the contract, screenshots of old messages, photographs from events where Leon and Ed stood side by side but did not touch. The plaintiffs read this as lack of natural intimacy. At one point, the lawyer said that this union is a typical example of using the institution of marriage to solve corporate problems without any real emotional bond. A low murmur ran through the room. Many of those present lived exactly that way, but preferred not to hear it spoken aloud. The defense did not react immediately. They let the other side speak, lay their cards on the table. Then one of Leon's partners stood up, a man known for his calm and his ability to make even unpleasant facts sound neutral. He did not pretend to be outraged. He did not argue that in their world, marriages were not about strategy. On the contrary, he pointed out that almost everyone in the room, including the plaintiffs, lived in a system where unions were measured in benefits, inheritance lines, and reputational capital. The difference here, he said, was that calculation did not cancel other layers. Leon and Ed's marriage had been concluded legally, without violation. The contract was transparent, obligations were being fulfilled, they lived together, financial responsibility was clearly distributed. There was no fraud. He did not try to paint an idol. He did not speak of great love or fateful meetings. Instead, he stressed that even in such a world, trust and mutual responsibility could appear, and that they could not always be reduced to profit. Especially if you compared it to how the Omega's own family had treated him, officially calling him our younger relative while using him as a shield. Then came the witnesses. House staff described the couple's daily life, that Ed had his own room and yet more and more often spent time in shared spaces, received firm guests, took part in receptions not as a mute shadow, but as someone whose presence mattered. Doctors confirmed that the Alpha had provided full medical and psychological support instead of keeping his partner dependent on medication. This part sounded prosaic, almost boring, but in that ordinariness lay its strength. A lot of facts, no drama, just steady strokes painting a picture of shared life. While witnesses took the stand one by one, Ed sat there with his hands clenched under the table. Sometimes a wave of déjà vu hit him. Voices describing his life without him sounded just as they had when the prosecutor had listed his crimes. Then he had kept quiet because that was the rule. Now his silence was a choice, and that made it harder. He heard his family's representatives skillfully twist meanings as they answered questions. They talked of care when it was about economic control, of gratitude when they recalled how much they had invested in his education. The words betrayal and greed were especially poisonous when they described his decision to pull away from them and run straight to a new patron after acquittal. At one point, one of their lawyers said something that made Ed's fingers turn white. He called him a man who will always sell his loyalty to whoever pays more. It hurt, not because it was true, but because it sounded too much like what Ed had thought about himself in his darkest nights. The judge, neither young nor old, had the tired look of someone who had seen too many family inheritance wars. Her voice, when she asked clarifying questions, carried no condemnation or pity, only professional weariness. But at one point, her tone changed. When yet another lawyer for the plaintiffs once again spoke for everyone except Ed, the judge interrupted him and said it was time to hear the Omega. A particular kind of silence filled the room, the kind that even cynics respect when they know something is about to be said that cannot just be cut from the record later. Ed stood up more slowly than he wanted. His knees felt foreign, his tongue heavy. He was no orator. He did not know how to speak beautifully. His life had passed behind other people's backs and computer screens. Others had always voiced the important decisions for him. He could have tried to play out a romantic script. He could have told a story about how the lawyer who saved him became the only light, and how, from the very first day, they were meant for each other. The room might even have been waiting for that, a neat fairy tale they could then pull apart. He chose something else. He spoke plainly. He said that for him the marriage really had started as a deal, that at that moment his only alternatives had been prison or a lifetime of being hunted by the same family that had already made him their scapegoat once. That Leon had offered him a contract where, for the first time in his life, not only his obligations but also his rights were clearly written down. He did not deny that the Alpha had his own interests: inheritance, a board vote, control over the firm. He did not pretend those motives did not exist. He underlined that it was exactly that clarity that had made the difference for him. For the first time, someone in power had not covered calculation with myths about family love, but had stated the stakes honestly. Then he talked about how life had changed after the contract, not in romantic terms, but in specifics. About the separate room no one had the right to open without his consent, about how no one brought him documents anymore saying, "Just sign, we will explain later," about how, when the new attack started, Leon had not stepped aside, had not written him off as a youthful mistake, but had put his own reputation and career on the same line as Ed's name. Someone in the room snorted when he said that the marriage had become both a cage and a rescue. Ed kept talking anyway, because that contradiction was the truth. He admitted he was dependent, financially, legally, and now, yes, emotionally as well. He admitted that without the Alpha, his name could easily be turned into a target again. He admitted that sometimes he was afraid it would all repeat, that they would once again make him the one to blame in somebody else's game. But he also said something no one expected. He said that despite all of that, he had never felt more like a subject and not an object. That in this marriage, even though it had been signed under the eye of lawyers and wills, he had for the first time gained the chance to choose in at least some things, to agree or not, to stay or go to another room and know that no one would break in after him shouting about family duty. He did not call it love. That word had been used too often by people who had hurt him. Instead, he chose a different word: respect. He said that in Leon he had seen a man who could admit his mistakes and did not push the blame onto someone weaker when the heat rose. The sentence sounded almost ordinary, but that ordinariness is what broke the pattern. In a world where the powerful like to cover their calculations with big declarations, this quiet acknowledgement of respect was like a revolver lying openly on the table. When Ed stopped talking, the silence in the courtroom grew heavier. Some people looked away, some leaned in. The judge wrote something down, but her face softened for a moment, like someone who had finally heard something different from the usual rehearsed speeches. Leon stayed silent the whole time. He did not interrupt, did not correct, did not whisper any hints. He sat with his hands folded and listened. Inside him, the professional who weighed every word for its effect on the case collided with the man hearing his own actions reflected in another person's voice. When the time came, the judge left for the deliberation room, and the courtroom filled with noise. Someone was already typing up messages to editors. Someone was arguing about each side's chances. For Ed, the waiting minutes were thick, like syrup. He stared at his hands and thought that he would never again be able to tell himself he had not tried. The decision was announced closer to evening. The court refused the claim to declare the marriage fake. The ruling stated, in dry legal phrases, that the union complied with the law, that both parties' intentions were clear and documented, and that there was no evidence the institution of marriage had been abused. The plaintiff's attempt to use calculation as a basis for invalidity was rejected. The court recognized that pragmatism did not cancel the validity of a union as long as both sides' rights were respected. Deeper in the text, there was another important line. The court separately noted that the Omega was not a passive object in this marriage, but made decisions that affected its content. For an outsider, this might sound like a mere formality. For Ed, it was official confirmation of something he was only beginning to believe. His relatives met the verdict with stone faces, jaws clenched, lips pressed into thin lines. They understood they had lost this round legally, but the war was not over for them. For Leon, the decision meant he kept control of his share, his board seat, and his ability to defend Ed with the full force of the law. For Ed, it meant something more fragile and precious. The first time in his life when he had spoken in public, not about what others wanted from him, but about how he saw his own story. Leaving the courtroom, he again walked beside Leon. The cameras flashed, questions flew through the air, but the noise no longer felt as deafening as before. Between him and that noise, there was an invisible we that now existed not only in the contract, but also in the court record. There were still cracks ahead, old wounds and unresolved questions. But one thing had been fixed. The The right to their union no longer belonged to their families, or the press, or colleagues. They had defended it with the only thing no lawsuit or will could take from them: their own voices. Their return from court did not look like a triumphant march. There was no champagne, no speeches, not even an aggressive attempt by the press to catch a comment at the door. The car drove into the underground garage. The gate came down, cutting off the last echoes of the noisy day, and the thick quiet of the house settled around them. The elevator seemed to rise longer than usual, or maybe time just slowed down. Ed watched his reflection in the metal wall and tried to understand who he had become: acquitted, confirmed, recognized as part of a union, or still that same man who had once signed a contract that his freedom depended on. The doors opened and let them into the cold, perfectly cleaned hallway. The house greeted them with familiar smells of coffee, paper, and expensive cleaning products. Everything was in its place. The only difference was that his presence here no longer felt like a temporary note in the lawyer's schedule. They went into the living room. Leon took off his jacket with a familiar motion and hung it on the back of a chair. Ed stopped by the window without turning on the lights. The city below glowed like a circuit board: office lamps, the cuts of highways, bursts of advertising screens. Out there, people were still debating their marriage, writing analytical pieces, arguing over the precedent. Here, inside, only one thing mattered: the pages they had signed months ago no longer matched what was happening between these walls. The contract folder found them before they found it. It lay in the office on the top shelf, where you put documents you think you will not need again, but also cannot throw away. Leon took it down, not because he planned to change it that very second, more as an honest gesture. They could no longer pretend it was not there. They sat facing each other at the same table where he had once bargained for his life and his name. Then, the air had been heavy with fear and need. Now it held fatigue and a strange, not yet formed wish to rebalance things. The old contract, printed on thick paper, looked foreign now. The clear legal phrases that had once seemed like the only possible protection now hurt the eye. You could hear the voice of the past in every clause: fear of losing the inheritance, fear of going back to the cell, fear of being used yet again as a tool. The terms were very clear. Ed's duties were listed in a long line: living under the same roof, appearing at events, protecting the image, refusing independent contracts, no right to break the marriage on his own for the first years. Leon's obligations took up fewer lines, but were just as strict: full financial support, legal protection, safety, fulfilling the will's requirements. Once this had felt like a fair trade, now it looked like a rough frame welded together from other people's greed and their own trauma. The rewriting did not begin with ink. It started with small things. First, space. In the old contract, his room was described as a personal space provided to the spouse at the discretion of the main property owner, a phrase with room for too many interpretations. In reality, Ed had long since spilled beyond that room. His things were scattered through the house: a book on the coffee table, a mug in the kitchen, a scarf on the back of a chair in the office. The house was no longer someone else's property where he was tolerated. It was a place where his presence was taken into account. They did not discuss this like a trade. It was more like taking inventory: the right to close his door and not let anyone in, including the alpha; the right to move furniture in his room without negotiating each shelf; the right to use the kitchen not only when it fit Leon's schedule. Then they talked about money. The old contract locked Ed into full financial dependence, all accounts under Leon's control, monthly support, strict limits on any independent spending. Logical if you saw the marriage as a tool and the spouse as a variable in an inheritance formula. Now it felt like a choking collar, not because Leon had abused that control, but because the system itself left no room to move. After a court fight where others had tried to label their union fake, the idea that any step he took could again be twisted into bought loyalty was unbearable. The talk about finances was dry, but crucial. They discussed a separate account in Ed's name which did not depend on Leon's mood: the possibility to choose himself where part of the money went: education, charity, his own projects. For Leon, it meant surrendering some control. For Ed, It meant his first real step away from being just a line item in someone else's budget. Work came next. The family company was long in ruins, and his name dragged a trail of scandal. The old contract quietly assumed that the role of the lawyer's spouse would be enough: appear at events, support the image, keep quiet when silence was convenient. Now, neither of them found that acceptable. Ed was tired of having his biography discussed only in relation to other people's cases. He did not want to go back to bookkeeping the way he had known it, but he could not stay an eternal escort either. The thought that his life would now be nothing but waiting for Leon to return home felt like slow self-destruction. They started looking for options, not what to make him into, but what made sense for him. Not as a big speech about dreams, but with simple questions. What was he best at? What gave him a sense of meaning, where his experience could be more than pain? Slowly, another line emerged, consulting those in similar situations, not as a lawyer, but as someone who had gone through accusations, family betrayal, trials, and a marriage signed under pressure. It was only an idea, a sketch, but the fact that there was now a perspective beyond attached spouse already changed the structure of their union. Their public life also needed rewriting. Previously, any public appearance was dictated by Leon's and the firm's interests, where they needed to be seen, what couple needed to be shown, what impression to make. Ed walked beside him like a perfectly ironed argument. I have a marriage, I am playing by the rules. After a trial in which his words had turned the tide, it felt strange to go back to being a silent shadow. He could no longer just stand and smile while others narrated his life. And Leon had to admit that the old strategy of less personal would no longer work. They agreed on simple things, that Ed had the right to be present at meetings about his name not only as decoration, but as a participant, that any interview touching on their marriage would be discussed beforehand, that both of them had the right to say, I do not want to talk about that. The clause on physical intimacy, written into the contract as a separate section, also stopped being just a formality. Before, it had been a set of dry lines saying that any intimacy was possible only by mutual consent, without pressure, with the right to withdraw at any time. It had been Leon's way of protecting himself and Ed, a way of saying on paper that he refused to repeat the mistakes of others, refused to demand or use force even when he wanted. By now their bodies had grown used to each other's presence, a shoulder on the same couch, casual touches, familiar warmth at night. The feelings lagged behind. Every attempt to take a step further ran into the shadow of the contract. Where did the duty to look like a couple end and personal desire begin? The rewriting here did not need new phrases. It needed honesty. The admission that they were drawn together not only by the shared war against their families and the firm, but also by something very simple: the way the other breathed nearby, the way his voice changed when he spoke not about documents, but about fear or something that made him laugh. They left that space open on purpose. They did not set deadlines or conditions. They agreed on only one thing. From now on, no gesture would be driven solely by, we need this for the picture. If something happened between them, it would not go into any protocol and would not be used as an argument in any process. At the same time, another kind of work went on, less visible but just as important: the inner work. For Leon, rewriting the contract meant giving up his usual model of control. For many years he had lived by a principle: the tighter the frame, the fewer chances that everything would fall apart again, like it had in his youth, when he had almost lost both career and reputation over feelings. Since then, he had trusted only the letter of the law and clearly written obligations. Now he had to trust what you cannot sign: a word, a look, small gestures no one would see but the two of them. He had to learn not to check every step Ed took, not to see each of his decisions as a potential threat to his position at the firm. He had to take his hand off the control lever and believe the structure would not collapse. For Ed, rewriting meant giving up his familiar role of the one who endures. All his life he had agreed, to unfair conditions, to devaluation, to having his name, voice, and body used in other people's games. He had even signed the first contract with clenched teeth, but still by inertia. I have no choice. Now, for the first time, He sat at the same table with the man whose decisions shaped his life and allowed himself to say, "This does not work for me." Not loudly, no scenes, but clearly. His voice shook sometimes, the words stuck, but the very fact that he said them already changed the balance of power. Some parts of the old contract remained on paper: the ban on sharing private details, the obligation to present a united front in public, joint responsibility for reputation. They could not erase calculation altogether. Their world still ran on numbers, shares, and agreements. But between the lines another layer appeared, one no notary could stamp. It showed itself in the way Leon put work aside when he saw Ed had frozen over a new wave of online debates about their case. In the way Ed now dared to interrupt Leon's schedule and drag him out for a short walk when tension in the house reached boiling point. In the way they started saying "we," not only in legal documents, but in everyday things. Our plans for the weekend, our risks, our shared exhaustion. Maybe the most important thing was that rewriting the contract stopped being a one-time act. They both knew there was no document that could forever fix every possible future. Life was too chaotic to fit into one spreadsheet, so the new agreement they were building, out of paper and unspoken rules, thoughtful silences and quiet, "let us do this differently," was alive. It could be added to, corrected, adjusted. Unlike the first one, which had stood like a concrete wall, this one was more like a flexible net. It held but did not choke. By the end of this chapter, the old contract still existed. It lay in a folder, on a shelf, in a safe, in an archive. But its role had changed. It was no longer their only support, just a starting point, an earlier version of a union they themselves had chosen to rewrite, and for the first time in a long time, both of them clearly understood. They could now stay together, not only because wills, courts, and reputations demanded it, but because in their unwritten new agreement there was room for their own choice.